Trigger warning. This episode contains descriptions of bodily harm and injury. Chapter 8. The Boogeyman. The Boogeyman is a creature that seems to evade description altogether, since there are so many interpretations of the creature. But what I have learned from research and experience is this. The spirit has a fondness for fear. Characteristics of the being differ across sources, but one thing in common is its connection to fear. Children fear the Boogeyman, the monster under the bed, the closet, not because it exists, but in all the ways it can scare them, whether it be by stealing their toys or turning into a million critters. In that way, the Boogeyman can morph into whatever terrifies you the most. Fear of the unknown, fear of losing the senses, fear of being lost, fear of nighttime critters, or fear of the night itself. But enough of describing the creature. As I have said before, I have not simply created this book to showcase the possibilities of these beings. I always pair my descriptions with evidence. This one is an account of my own, during my youth. When I was a boy, I attended accelerated night classes at a school called Desdemona Preparatory Academy. It was a school for elite, privileged youth during the day, and hosted classes for others in the evenings. Night school was a lonely, lonely place when I first started attending. I still remember walking in on the first day and being deathly afraid of the dark staircase leading to the basement where classes were held. I would arrive every evening at 6 p.m. and I'd be the only one there. I remember the abrupt click of my shoes echoing in the hall, like there was no one else in the world except for me and my tack, tack, tack on the cold stone of those stairs. But even more than that, I had been scared of my classmates. I had never made friends easily, but perhaps with the opportunity to study with like-minded individuals, I would finally be able to get to know someone. I was completely wrong on that front. When I walked in on the first day, I heard a couple of girls sneer. "That's the witch's son." The witch? With black magic? They whispered among themselves as I took a seat, trying to ignore the snake-like hisses coming from around me. Coming from people who looked like me but acted like they didn't. Perhaps they thought that their new leather boots and styled hair meant they were above me. Daughters of lawyers and sons of pastors. "Yes, sir, they say she can turn you blind if you look in her eyes. She eats newts for breakfast," one of the boys snickered. "Ew," the girls giggled, loud enough for me to hear. After class ended, a group of boys knocked over my books and ran up to the first floor, screeching with laughter. And I was left alone to pick them up and make my way up those horrid stairs. The railing curled, winded its way to the top, dust gathering on it like it had been touched in a while, lonely in a sense. As I trekked my way up the basement, each of the steps clicking, ascending notes like a horribly out-of-tune drum, I heard a different sound, a voice just as I made it to the door on the top. "Boo!" I flinched and stumbled back. My ankle hit the top of those wretched stairs, and I made my way down the hard way. The first thing I smelled when I woke up was dust and the stale smell of paper. A chandelier covered in cobwebs glittered in front of me, twinkling quietly as a breeze from the open window was caught in its light. I was lying on an old couch, smelling of mold, and there was a brown-skinned boy peering at my face. His eyes lit up when he realized I was awake. "You're alive," he exclaimed, and then went on about how he had to carry me to the couch after I had blacked out, and how heavy I was, and how glad he was that I wasn't dead because of him. I told him that was nice and all, but I should really get going. But he didn't let me go so fast. He introduced himself, saying his name was Octavius and that this room was where he hosted club meetings. He asked if I'd like to join. I couldn't deny I was curious. I looked around at the dust coating the many, many shelves and a distant window, looking into a room that I could only assume was where they made the morning announcements. "What do you do here in this club?" I asked. He explained Using all manners of gesture that he and his clubmates, he had none at the time, gathered in this room, whose key he had stolen from an aging teacher, who was so old he was practically blind, and embarked on adventures of knowledge and quests of research. It was so amusing I imagine I must have laughed out loud, to which Octavius took a grave insult and showed me a secret door in the room that connected to the vast library upstairs, to prove his endeavors were real. Octavius took me through the towering columns of colorful books, and down deep into the library's center, where he pointed to various volumes he had used for his research. A book on Egyptian mythology, a book on Nordic monsters, and then another on Eastern religion of the 1500s. We would stay in the library for hours on end, reading and laughing and climbing the ladders while the other tried to topple the one climbing. But each day ended with the library door slamming in front of me, while Octavius waved me goodnight, returning inside the treasure trove of books to continue his research or fill his brain with information I lusted for and couldn't have. Each day ended with me roaming the dark halls, taking my time to get to the main entrance, long after everyone else had left. I would look back and the only light in the school was the one under the library doors. But from the day that he showed me the special secret room, with the special secret entrance, we were inseparable. I had finally found a friend, someone who listened, but did not shame. No, instead, he seemed to have a fascination, a genuine curiosity for everything and anything. He would constantly ask me the most absurd questions. Oscar, why do you think the moon is round? Why do you think the crickets chirp? Do you think it's possible to see into the future? On and on and on. Almost ceaselessly he would interrogate me, but he would never let me discover much about him. I learned later that he was supposed to be in a grade higher than me, since he was a year older. When I asked him why he was taking supplemental night classes for a grade he already graduated from, he told me he didn't attend day school, so this was the only way he'd be able to learn anything. When I asked him why he didn't attend day school, he then answered with a grin, "It caused too much trouble for that." But then when I asked him what trouble specifically, he stuttered, as if scared, and avoided the question altogether. There were abnormalities all around him and who he was. I remember once pointing to one of the portraits of the previous school principals, gray in the darkness of the evening, and joked that he and the principal, sharing a last name, meant he would turn out as ugly as the old man in the picture. He turned pale at the mention of the man in the photo and gave a weak laugh. There were other times when I would call his name and he wouldn't respond, like it wasn't his name at all. Saturdays were the worst days of the week back then. I was confined to my mother's store, dusting the shelves of baubles and trinkets, and sweeping the floor of any dirt. My ma took customers in the back behind heavy purple curtains that revealed incense and smoke when you opened them. This came with a voice beckoning, "Come in. Welcome to Madame Selenites." The customers would disappear inside with an apprehensive look. Outside, people walking around in the heat of summer days, crunching through the snow of winter, would cross themselves, glaring distrustfully at the skinny boy sweeping his mama's practice, smelling like spices and smoke. Weekdays were a different story. I was free to play around in Octavius's library, even though everything was borrowed and nothing was mine. One day, he let me wander again, checking through different sections while he lounged on an armchair with a book in his hand and glasses perched on the peak of his nose. He saw me enter through the secret door and lit up immediately. "Oscar," he burst out, and quickly waved a slip of paper at my face. "Is this your mother?" he questioned, brown eyes blown wide from curiosity. What could I have done? Lie? Instead, I nodded, waiting for the accusing and the finger-pointing. But Octavius's eyes only widened. "May I meet her? She'll be useful for my research." He wanted to meet her, for his research. A feeling settled in the pit of my stomach, and it made me want to frown. I was surprised, to say the least, and had to fight to hide it from him. I didn't want him to know what the community thought of my mother. I didn't want him to think what the others thought. I could only give a half nod and say, "Maybe later," to which he grinned. I disappeared behind a bookcase so he wouldn't see me, and plucked a blue-spined book off the shelf and shoved it into my bag. I told him I was going home early. My mother needed me, I said, and he nodded and gestured to the door. See yourself out, he seemed to say, still sitting in his armchair, leg crossed over the other, the way the fathers read newspapers in the morning, the way politicians sat, smoking out of pipes and shiny black shoes. I made my way home and collapsed in my bed. My heart was pounding 1,000 miles per hour, like it was trying to run itself out of state, and someplace, any place else. I stayed up reading that slim blue book all night. It was ridiculously old. The print was faded, enough that I had to squint in the moonlight to make out the words. It was an old fairy tale book about the Boogeyman. Curling font embossed on the cover, the sketches inside almost made it seem handmade, like someone had poured their soul into this small book, just in case I found it and needed it. There was someone scribbling at the end, and the blank pages all the way in the back, past the last page of the book. It looked like a recipe, numbered with multiple steps, except the steps weren't in English. I could only guess Latin or Greek, but neither seemed correct. It looked like a language of its own. I shut the old blue book and guilt clenched at my heart. I shouldn't have stolen it. Why did I need to? I could have just read it with Octavius like always. Why did I have to be selfish? Overcome with wrong, I made up my mind to put it back on its shelf. The next day I prayed to make it so that classes would finish on time and not run late, so I could run upstairs and place that book back in its place among Octavius's treasures. But they ran late anyways, and I made the trek up to the library in harrowing anxiety. Octavius had not attended class today. What if he was waiting there for me, to catch me red-handed? I opened the secret library door with a resounding creak. There wasn't any lights turned on inside. I sighed in relief. Octavius wasn't here. Making my way to the shelf I got the book from, I found it strange. Octavius should be here. He's always here after class finishes, even if he didn't attend the lesson itself. Did he have somewhere to be? It was almost summer. I suppose his parents took him on a trip. That is what most students at Desdemona did, after all. I heard my name being spoken from behind and snapped out of my thoughts with a jump. It was Octavius, watching me with my arm raised, seconds away from putting the blue book back on its shelf. So it was you. You stole my book, he said. I backed away, excuses rolling out of my mouth like precious pearls. But Octavius didn't stop stalking towards me till we were in the back of the library with no place to run. He raised a singular eyebrow, watching the way I clutched the book to my chest. He raised a hand and pushed me lightly. Then he raised both hands and shoved me so hard I fell back, inches in front of a roaring fireplace. Before I could have asked him what he was doing, he spat. I should have never let you in here, and reached for the fire poker. I tried saying his name again, but he raised the poker and slammed it down, hard. It would have gotten me in the chest if I hadn't held the small blue book in between us. Right now, it seemed like it was the only thing protecting me from Octavius's privileged rage. Shadow seemed to pour from his mouth when he opened it to roar, and ever since he looked non-human. At that moment he raised the poker again, and the images of haunting illustrations painted in the blue book, the book I had stayed up all night reading, flashed before my eyes. This wasn't Octavius. This was the Boogeyman. The book once again took the brunt of the hit from the poker, giving me enough time to roll away, scamper to my feet, and run. I dashed quickly down the library stairs, almost tripping over myself. Through the window, I noticed how high the moon in the sky was. It must have been at least midnight. The realization chilled my bones and caused a shiver through me. Our classes ended at 9 p.m. I only ever stayed as late as 10. How had I spent 3 hours here already? I gazed at the moon and failed to notice the shadow that had slipped past me, clustered in the lobby. I saw it when I got closer, and my eyes began to widen. My hands began to shake. The cold in my fingers turned scorching with fear. I couldn't move a step, much less run, as the scribble of darkness approached me. No feet, no hands, no body. Just a cloud of smoke, like the clouds that had eclipsed the moon. I called out Octavius's name, but just like all those times before, he didn't recognize it. The only feeling I felt besides being numb at the moment was fear, this stagnant pressure growing in my chest, spilling out of my skin. The shadow crawled nearer, so near I thought I could peer into its darkness and see Octavius trapped beneath it. Tears poured down from my eyes. I couldn't feel them, but I could see my vision blur, taste the salt in my mouth, too much for it to be tears. So much, for a second I thought it might be blood. It was. The metal, the tang of it, I could feel its presence. The darkness in front of me stepped once more. It touched the tip of my face, and I took a wavering breath. Or at least I tried to take a breath. There was no air. I couldn't breathe. No air. Nothing. The darkness, the spirit was a vacuum. No air, no life, nothing but malice. And that was its terror. Its tentacle of shadows lifted me high above the ground. I tried to plead for my life. I tried begging, but no sound came out. The lack of air meant all I could do now was scrape my throat until it was bleeding and my choked sounds were raw. I managed to say one last thing, though, with the little air left in my lungs, with what I believed in that moment was my final words. I'm your friend, Octavius. The shadow's grip loosened, and I fell to the marble floor. The sky flashed and rain pounded against the windows. When I managed to look at Octavius again, smoke poured from his clothes. His face was covered in lightning white flames, and froth from his mouth had dribbled down his chin onto his school uniform. I quickly grabbed the poker he dropped and pointed it at his chest, shaking with relief. My witch mother had always said, the more you fear spirits, the stronger they become. I could not afford to be afraid, not right now. Back away, I told the being that was Octavius. The being stared and grinned, revealing sharp white teeth and bleeding gums. He hissed, and I could see he was not going to let me go. He was not going to let Octavius go. There was only one thing to do. I gripped my poker hard enough to bleed and pushed it through Octavius's chest. He staggered into it, as if trying to get closer to me. With each step, the rod was being pushed deeper and deeper into his bleeding, dying chest. He gurgled horribly, blood coating the foam in his mouth as he spit and gagged. I twisted the poker with an awful squelch, watching as Octavius's head jerked. He shook like the storm raging outside was inside him. Then he was still. I was wheezing, trembling like a newborn lamb, so much so that my legs gave out and I toppled back, Octavius landing on top of me. The poker was buried to the hilt. In one final act of strength, I managed to push him off of me and stood, feeling like thunder was battling inside my stomach. I gripped my teeth and willed everything in my body to move. Move. My gaze twitched down to my hands. I mentally pushed my fingers to move. My nails connected with my pants and I pushed. I grazed and buried them into the fabric of my trousers, clawing and clawing and clawing until searing pain broke me out of my trance, and I finally regained my senses. I forced my legs to get me to the door, tripping halfway and crawling the rest. I didn't hesitate until I was out. Once outside, on my back, I looked up at the last of the shadows sprinting behind me and slammed the door shut on them. I remembered then I could finally breathe and took in a mouthful of the night air. My hands were covered in blood. I learned later I had dug around 3 centimeters into my thigh with my clawing hands, and in my panic, slipped down the entrance stairs, passing out at the bottom and waking up again in the hospital. I refused to answer any of the doctor's questions, and shut myself up in my room when I was discharged, waiting for the police to arrive at Ma's shop, ready to lock me up. But they never did. Octavius's family never pressed charges. Imagine that. Your family leaving you to roll in your grave without peace, never seeking justice for your death. I imagine that his life was like that too. Perhaps that's why we became friends. 2 lonely kids who loved adventure a little too much. My personal account weird. It's never acted like this before. Maybe it's because of the storm?
Wait! It's odd. Sid. Oh, you buffoon.
What? It was just off.
Classic history major. It's like you're ancient yourself. Here, keep reading.
Fine. My personal account with the Boogeyman can be challenged in many ways. Personal accounts rarely have empirical evidence. But this is exactly why so many of the creatures in this book evade human science. Without a clear picture, without an actual trail, personal accounts are dismissed as myth and legend, and the monsters continue to lurk. The Boogeyman does this especially. He lurks in the shadows, watching. Nothing is worse than being watched. All of your hideous secrets known. All of you. What makes you tick? What makes you cry? And most importantly, what scares you? This is what the Boogeyman capitalizes on. Being a warrior in the corner of your room. A shadow. A creature of fear. A spirit that is nothing but a disgusting reflection of yourself. Beware the Boogeyman. This concludes chapter 8. Son of a...